If I had to map out like what are the 3 most important skills that will allow you to be successful in the bodybuilding stage, this comes down to being able to act when you should, to be able to not act when you shouldn't, and to be able to be patient really throughout any kind of season phase that you're going through. There are phases that we go through as bodybuilders that like no matter how disciplined you might feel, like you are still going to have to execute, I guess, exercise willpower to an extent that is uncomfortable. And the ability to feel these levels of discomfort and continue to say, okay, but what is the plan? The plan is to not do X, Y, and Z. So I'm not going to do that. The plan is to do this, this, and this. So I'm going to do that. The plan, regardless of how it feels, even if I feel very uncomfortable, is to get on this stage and get on this stage in seemingly really good shape. So in order to do that, I have to continue to lose fat. In order for me to lose fat, that means that I can't just act on impulse in this moment, even though that impulse is going to return and probably be very persistent for every moment between now and then the show, and then it's going to continue after the fact. And that's where I think working on these skills in isolation and working on them to a volume and at a frequency in which they become second nature, I really think is what's going to allow you not just to do well on a bodybuilding stage, but is what's going to give you the control over your body composition that you're so keen on. And I think for me, what really allowed me to move the fastest forward just in my own athletic development was focusing less on what I was feeling and trying to find a solution to resolve that feeling, but rather, what are the actions I'm committed to making? What are the things that I agreed to do in order to compete in this sport or in order to be successful in this very acute endeavor? And do those commitments still align with overall what I want and what I need to be fulfilled and to be happy? And is this feeling, is it stronger than those commitments? And I think when I started to force myself to confront, are these feelings stronger than those commitments? It became very apparent. It's like, no, like the feeling of slight discomfort, the feeling of, I feel very fatigued, the feeling of I don't feel motivated. I don't want to lift. I don't want to work out hard. I want to go home. I want to sleep. I want to eat whatever I want and not have to think twice about whether or not this is going to set me back. Those are all transient and they do pass. I know they pass because they resurface as well, just as quickly. So for me, like, I think there's a power in being able to break down. It's like, okay, let's do an inventory on the skills that you're missing that ultimately would allow you to be much better at doing the thing that you're trying to do. So maybe that isn't bodybuilding, but maybe that's like, hey, I want to do fat loss. I want to wake up and not think twice about the clothes that I put on my body, or think if this outfit, if I am lean enough, skinny enough to wear it. I just want to be able to go into my closet, close my eyes, put on whatever I want, and feel like, okay, no matter what I put on, I'm going to feel confident in it. Well, that isn't like that confidence, that skill of confidence that I think people tend to associate as like things that you were born with, things that people just have. And I don't think that's true. I think it's something that we foster or we snuff out. And I think a lot of times what will happen is people will begin to make comparisons to people who are like completely, like they're not at all in competition with, just comparisons to like, well, this girl's getting ready for this show and she seems to handle her off season well. And this is generally how I want to be. So if I'm not where she is, then I'm not doing things correctly. And I think that's where we go wrong, because we're using a reference point that is not relative to where we are in our own personal development. But why is that tough? It's tough because it takes being very honest, being brutally honest about things that I believe are very vulnerable to each of us. So by doing this, you demystify the ambiguity with like, well, how is she so motivated? How does he just have this like super high work ethic? And really what it comes down to is like, there's this huge disconnect between what people want, how they describe what they want, and what it actually takes for them to get where they want to go and to achieve said thing. And that's the scary thing. Like, I've had people tell me, like, they think that I'm very confident on stage. They think that, my stage presence is, generally good. I feel like, okay, I don't necessarily feel that confidence because, part of, my development in developing my stage presence has been just being very transparent with, like, I'm not very comfortable. And comfortability is something I associate with confidence. Is like, okay, for me to be confident on stage, I need to feel very comfortable. And especially when I haven't been posing a lot, or it's not something that I'm, really like up to my knees in, it's certainly something like if I were to right now get on stage and pose, I'd be like, I don't feel the most comfortable because I'm very out of practice. And that's an important key component to feeling confident on stage. Like, for instance, I had a girl reach out. We were doing a consultation. We were talking about training. She's like, do you work with anyone like on mindset? Like, did you ever work with someone yourself to work on your mindset as it came to like feeling like you belong on stage? Like, how did you like combat imposter syndrome? And truly, like, I don't think that I have imposter syndrome. I don't think that that's necessarily what I've had in the past. I think I've just looked at my skill set and I've honed in on areas that frankly are very, very underdeveloped or underdeveloped relative to how developed I want them to be. And that like brash realization has made this sense of urgency for me to be like, oh, like I need to focus on this. I need to, okay, if I want to be successful, that means I need to work towards this. And I think sometimes that urgency, that like almost like anxious energy can really cloud your view of yourself. And in my case, like it very much has made me feel like, okay, like if I want to be successful, there isn't a lot of room in the development process. I just need to get there. And that can be a little overwhelming, but at the same time, I think it's very unrealistic to just expect yourself to not have this skill developed and then just immediately know what you need to do in order to be an expert at this. And I would say, like, in the instance with like dieting is a great example of something that a lot of people, they can feel like, I am not someone who knows how to be adherent. I'm not someone who knows how to make good choices when willpower is low. That's where I find it really helpful. And I try to do this with clients, is like parse out, like, what are the 18 things that you need to do and you need to be aware of, or you need to at least consider, you need to ask yourself in order for you to be someone who feels confident in your ability to follow a diet, in order for you to feel like you can be adherent. And I think a lot of this comes down to being able to pause and understand, like, okay, what is my goal? What is the thing that I'm working towards? I'm working towards getting leaner. So is what I'm about to consume, is this in line with that goal? And if it's not in line, am I comfortable with the consequences of this not being in line? Do I have enough wiggle room? Do I have this slush fund that essentially would allow me to get away with eating off track? I think a lot of people just jump to the conclusion like, okay, I'm either on plan or I'm not on plan, and there's no in between, and there's no forgiveness, and there's no context, and it doesn't matter if this is somewhat trackable. If I'm on plan, I'm on plan, and if I'm not, I'm not. And I think when you really break down the context and the decision making around individual foods, I think all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier to metabolize. And you're like, okay, well, this is what it takes in order for me to go out to eat and not make shithead decisions that ultimately will make me feel like crap tomorrow when I go and get on the scale. It's like, I could give you a handbook and tell you like, hey, these are the things you need to be aware of. Here are the 10 things that you need to be aware of as soon as the food comes out. You need to consider whether or not there are additional calories, whether that be in oil or in sauces. Does the portion sizing look correct? Do you feel like it's cooked in a way that, potentially in the future, you could have ordered it to be cooked that would result in a lower total calorie intake for the meal? Did you plan accordingly going into the meal? Did you budget enough calories that the total amount of calories you're eating at this meal out is still within a reasonable amount that you can assume you're not going to be too far off track? Did you plan to have a rest day today, even though you knew you were going to have an untracked meal? Do you plan to have a rest day tomorrow? And is that in line with you reaching your goal of losing body fat? Assuming that now we know you're probably going to be over in calories today, and this could even be a more sedentary day in a whole as a whole. So maybe in the future it would make sense if you had a training day planned on the day of your cheat meal as well as the day afterwards. But in actuality, it's not that easy. Like, I can give you a guide, I can make a fucking ebook and just be like, oh yeah, here's your checklist for when you go out to eat, here are all the things that you need to think about. But the reality is, some of these things you don't need to think about. Some of these things are second nature to you, and you already have the answers because you just do this innately. And for other people, I might be pointing out things that are very obvious, and they're like, oh, well, I do the opposite of this every time I go out to eat. So I can't imagine doing anything differently. And that's where having that exposure, not only being able to make the decision that you believe is the best decision that's in line with your interest, but then being able to reflect and audit, like, was this actually the best decision? Or was I acting off emotion? Was I acting off of impulse? That to me is the key. And that is like, if you want to learn something, like, I'm immediately thinking, okay, what do I have to do? And if this isn't something that we can like break down and be like, this is what you have to do and this is what you shouldn't do, if we can't define like clear boundaries, then I mean, I start to question whether or not there's actually a criteria with like the goal in mind. So in the case of like, I want you to be mindful when you go out to eat, that's pretty ambiguous. For some people, that could very well mean that like, I'm going to go out and I am only going to have a salad. I'm not going to get dressing, any toppings on it, like croutons or cheese, I'm going to order on the side, and I'm going to get chicken breast. But if there's any oil on the chicken breast, then I'm only going to eat half of it. That's pretty restrictive. And maybe for some people that actually is what they need to do based on their goal. Maybe you're in a bit of a time crunch, and because of maybe a deadline that you have, you know, relative to a show, maybe you can't afford to have a meal that isn't 100% tracked. But in that case, I mean, like, wouldn't it also be true that maybe when you go out to eat, if you go out to eat at all, the answer isn't to even eat? It's just to go and, you know, enjoy the experience of being around, you know, the company that you're with. But the focus shouldn't necessarily be on necessarily getting food in, because the food is not 100% trackable. And that's where you have one camp over here where that end of the spectrum is quite the reality for some individuals. But then you have the other end of the spectrum where it's like, me saying be mindful is like, okay, when we go out, I'm going to have one dessert with my partner and we're just going to split it. We're not going to each get our own, but we're still going to get appetizers. We're still going to get full entrees, but I'm just going to pull back a little bit on that final treat. And like, people want to have these very strict and rigid like rules and be like, okay, well, when I go out to eat, I only do X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't challenge you to develop autonomy around food behaviors. It doesn't put you in a position where there is a degree of balance that's required. Like having like just hyper restrictive, hyper rigid, you know, this is how I eat 100% of the time unless I'm going off track. It doesn't put you in a position of power. It puts you in a position where going out to eat is the liability. Like, not having control of your food is something that will always be problematic. And really, when it comes down to like being able to learn, like, you get a return on learning from an experience. And the only downfall is if like you come out of an experience, you're like, okay, well, that wasn't the outcome that I was hoping for. But rather than do an audit, rather than reflect and figure out, okay, what would have allowed me to be at least closer to the desired outcome, you just move on and say, whatever. Listening, reflecting, learning, these are the things that are going to give you the highest return on your effort, even if your effort results in an outcome that you didn't necessarily desire. And eventually, if you do learn, you should be in a position, like you should be able to put yourself in that position where you're closer to that desired outcome.